This is test 65, section 4, question 21. I guess I'll go ahead and read it. It says
Yeah.
this is a philosopher. To explain the causes of cultural phenomena, a social scientist needs data about several societies. One cannot be sure, for example, that a given political structure is brought about only by certain ecological or climatic factors unless one knows that there are no similarly structured societies not subject to those factors, and no societies that through subject to those subject to those factors are not so structured. Boy,
It's
that
all
was
one
one
sentence.
sentence. Yeah,
Yeah.
and I probably should have stopped at the colon and maybe some other places. So going back to explain the causes of cultural phenomena, a social scientist needs data about several societies. That kind of makes sense to me. Basically, right? If you want to figure out what's causing something, it'd be helpful to have multiple data points, not just one, because then you can be more sure that that's likely the cause, that there really is some sort of correlation between that cause and whatever cultural phenomena is happening.
Yeah. And maybe personalize it. Think of any cultural phenomena, right? How about being a dick in YouTube comments?
Sure.
That's a cultural phenomena. YouTube
Yep.
comments are insanely evil.
Yep.
Why is that? I want to understand why everybody's a dick in YouTube comments.
And if you just have one culture or one society to look at, you're gonna be kind of guessing at the potential causes. I mean, you can certainly have your guess, but if you had multiple societies, especially ones that didn't have, right, those people being dicks in YouTube
Well,
comments,
yeah. So I
then
immediately
you could
was like,
really look, yeah.
hey, I'm an American. I look
Mhm.
at YouTube and I don't know if it's like American YouTube, but probably the videos that I watch tend to be American. And so the commenters probably tend to be American and everybody's a dick. But if I started looking at, videos about the Canadian healthcare system or the Canadian Mounties,
Mounties.
the cops in Canada,
Oh,
they're called
no,
Mounties.
I did not know that.
Yeah. Well, maybe not the cop. Anyways, it's they're like rangers. They're like Canadian. They're kind of like park rangers, or at least they dress like that. Um, Point being, if I looked on Canadian YouTube, I may or may not find people being dicks in the YouTube comments.
Yeah.
Okay. So if I'm a social scientist and I want to understand
Mhm.
why people are being dicks on American YouTube,
Mhm.
I'm going to need to get data about several different societies like Canada, where people are nicer. Everything is a social phenomena, right? It's like the
Yeah.
behavior of people. So
Yep.
whatever, to understand
Rioting.
why people do what they do,
Yeah.
you need to understand, you got to get data from several societies. That also kind of sounds like a conclusion a little bit, right? Like, why do you believe that?
Yeah.
Like, why can't I
Well,
just understand YouTube comments based on American data? Why do I need multiple?
yeah. Do I really need, or can I just do it from one society?
Yeah, do I buy
Um,
that idea or do I not buy that idea?
and the next sentence says, one cannot be sure. For example, and examples,
Oh,
by the way, are always premises.
all
So
right,
the
go ahead.
next part of this sentence, because there's only one in this entire thing, says one cannot be sure, for example, that a given political structure is brought about only by certain ecological or climatic factors. So I'm going to stop there.
Wow.
Um, so you talked about, people being dicks in YouTube comments. This is, of course, talking about something much more abstract, but it's still something we can make concrete. A given political structure is, a democracy or a government, and um,
You could even stick
versus
with the
like a monarchy or something, right?
you could switch examples here if you wanted to. I
Mm-hmm.
encourage students to be fluid with whatever example they're thinking about, but this actually works. People talk about the ecosystem inside YouTube,
Mm-hmm.
and there is a political structure inside YouTube. there's moderation, there's voting, there's flagging, there's, blocking, there's all kinds of structures, which you could call a political structure. Maybe it's a
Sure.
dictatorship if YouTube is just, in charge of it, which is still a political structure.
Mm-hmm.
And it is like a little ecosystem inside there, right? There's like behavior moderation and cultural factors. And so you don't necessarily need to get off of the YouTube example in order to just say, okay, so do we know that the way that the YouTube, for example, people getting blocked on YouTube or Trump getting blocked on Twitter,
Yeah.
right? We don't know that came from certain ecological factors. In other words, the ecology of YouTube.
Or even the ecology of things around YouTube, right? Like the environment that it's in.
The fact that people are sitting in their basement, mom's basement, in front of a screen all day without any actual human contact.
Yeah.
Right? We can't be sure that that's what causes this behavior of being a dick, or the moderation or lack thereof of people being dicks. We can't be sure that that arose from this particular ecology unless what? So the unless now is going to say, well, here's how we can.
Yep. Unless one knows that there are no similarly structured societies not subject to those factors. So I'm going to stop there again. So we have to know. So you can't know what brought about this political structure or this system by these factors unless you know there's no one else, no other systems that are not subject to those factors. And we also know that no societies that those subject to those factors are not so structured. So there's two ideas. They're a little bit wordy, but I get what it's trying to say. You have to know that there isn't something else just like what you're looking at, but came about without the causes you think might have caused it. In other words,
you'd need a society where people weren't in their mom's basement without any human
and still
interaction.
dicks, right?
You'd need a place where everybody hangs out in public with friends and they're on YouTube in a big group of people, and they're not isolated and they're not hidden behind their screen, and yet they're still being dicks in the YouTube comments.
Yep. So you need to know that there's none of those. And you'd also need to know that there are no societies that, even though they have those factors, don't end up having people be dicks.
And right. So there you would need people isolated in their mom's basement, hiding behind a screen all day and not being dicks on YouTube.
Yep. If you have either one of those things, then your causal connection is at least suspect. All right. So the question says, the claim that to explain the causes of cultural phenomena, a social scientist needs data about several societies, plays which one of the following roles in the philosopher's reasoning? Well, okay, this is a reasoning question. It's asking us what role in particular the first sentence is playing in the argument as a whole. We already talked about that. We saw that the second half of this sentence, everything after the colon, is an example, which is always evidence. And it's an evidence for what was said before. And we already were wondering whether that was a conclusion. And then we knew it was the conclusion. So all they're doing is asking us, hey, what's the first part of this argument doing? And we're saying, well, that's the conclusion.
People struggle with reasoning questions, or particularly these role questions. They think that they're like really highly technical, and people way overthink it.
Mm-hmm.
Are they asking you? So the claim is to explain the causes of cultural phenomena, a social scientist needs data about several societies. Okay. It was either the conclusion, or it was a premise in support of the conclusion, or it was something else. And we look back at this argument and we go, well, yeah, that was the conclusion. They started with it. Then they gave a lengthy example. All the argument had was an example in favor of this conclusion. So it's the conclusion of the argument. And you got to do that independent of the answer choices, man. You, the second you start reading the answer choices, you're toast. If you don't go into these answers knowing that this is the conclusion of the argument, you're done.
Okay. So answer choice A. It describes a problem that the philosopher claims is caused by the social scientist's need for certainty. I'm already like, ugh.
Ain't no problem. It's the
Yeah.
conclusion of the argument.
Yep.
They gave a conclusion, then they gave the example to support that conclusion. If
Yep.
the answer doesn't say it's the conclusion of the argument, it's not the answer. So I think I would read the first half of that and I'd be like, goodbye.
B. It is a premise. Goodbye.
Yeah, it's not, it's just, it is the conclusion of the argument. So we don't need to read any further.
Yeah, we don't have like any intermediate conclusions here or anything that could be a conclusion and a premise at the same time. So this is gone. C, it is a general hypothesis that is illustrated.
I'm interested. I'm listening. I'm interested.
I'm listening. So if something, in this case, a general hypothesis, is illustrated by something else, then it is a conclusion, possibly.
I mean, they gave an
illustrated.
example, right?
Yeah.
Example and illustration mean the same thing.
Also means premise. So it is a general hypothesis that is illustrated with an example showing that there is a causal relationship between political structures and environmental conditions. Ooh. Did the example show that there's a causal relationship? No, it just said, hey, you got to figure out whether there's a correlation here. Whether or not there's a causal relationship is a whole nother issue. So
yeah, showing, by the way, on the LSAT means proving.
Yep.
And they didn't even try to prove that there is a causal relationship between political structures and environmental conditions. Yep. Let alone did they actually prove that there is a causal relationship between political structures and environmental conditions. That wasn't their point. There was an example that was, hey, you'd have to research this to figure out whether it was the environmental conditions that was causing the political structures.
Mm-hmm.
The topic is right. The structure of that answer is actually really good, because if that said it's a general hypothesis that's illustrated with an example, and then they correctly described what the example actually did, but it went wrong at the word showing there. They did not prove anything about a causal relationship between these two conditions.
Yeah. D, it is a dilemma that, okay, I'm not sure what they mean by dilemma. I'm already skeptical. I'm still curious. So I'm reading a little bit more.
It's not conclusively wrong yet.
Yeah, but I'm suspect.
I don't remember this being proposed as a dilemma. That's a weird word choice, but if the rest of the answer was spot on, I'm willing to say dilemma, maybe a dilemma is a thing that you are forced to do, which kind of the conclusion was a thing that you're forced to do if you're a social scientist. So
I'm not excited.
I'm not excited.
Not
but
excited.
I can't.
Not excited, but
yeah,
I'm not going to just be like, oh yeah, well this said premise, so we're out of here.
Yeah, right.
It is a dilemma that it is argued is faced by every social scientist.
And if dilemma means thing you have to do, then this answer so far is correct.
Because it said a social scientist needs data. It didn't say some or most.
A social scientist means every social scientist. So yeah.
Yeah. Is faced by every social scientist because of the difficulty. I'm willing to stop here.
They never said difficulty.
They never talked about any of this being difficult. I imagine it is. And I imagine people would read it and think it does sound difficult because you got to go find all these structures.
They didn't say
it.
They didn't say that this is you have to do it because of the difficulty of what? That's not relevant. And then it goes on and it's wrong again. Keep going a little bit
Sure.
farther.
Because of the difficulty of determining whether a given cultural phenomenon is the cause or the effect of a given factor. Never talked about this back and forth like,
No,
oh, are you the cause or are you the effect or
right.
what? Yep.
Reversal of cause and effect is really common on the LSAT, but this philosopher was not at all talking about difficulty of cause and effect. So it feels as if we've eliminated A, B, C, and D.
Yep. E. It is the claim that the philosopher attempts to justify. Okay, well, that would fit the definition of a conclusion. You're trying to justify your conclusions. It is a claim that the philosopher attempts to justify by appeal to the requirements for establishing the existence of one kind of causal relationship. Um, okay.
One
Are those
kind of causal relationship here is their example of,
Mhm.
hey, you're not going to know whether a certain political structure is brought about by whatever ecological or climatic factors. You're not going to know that. You're going to have a hard time establishing the existence of that causal relationship. You're going to have, because there are, how do you know that the effect doesn't happen without the cause? And how do you know that the cause doesn't happen without the effect? Those are the requirements for establishing or proving that there is that causal relationship.
Yeah. Um, I'm also just thinking of the phrasing here. One cannot be sure unless that's giving you a requirement.
Sure. Yeah. Unless is setting up a conditional statement, which means
Yep.
that there is a sufficient and a necessary condition, or a necessary condition meaning being the same thing as a requirement.
All
Yeah.
right.
You can't.
I'm submitting this answer. Whew,
Did you get it right?
it's green.